Alaska Insight is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers just like you. Thank you.
Alaska adopted a new voting system in 2020 that is unique in the nation, but a ballot initiative in this year's election seeks to repeal it. Should Alaskans support open primaries and ranked choice voting or reject it? We'll hear from advocates on both sides right now on Alaska Insight. Good evening. The voting system that Alaskans approved in 2020 was first used in the 2022 special election to fill the remainder of the late Don Young's U.S. House seat. In the upcoming November election, Alaskans will vote to either reject or retain the system. Tonight we'll hear positions on either side of this ballot measure, but before we get to that discussion, here are some of the top stories of the week from Alaska Public Media's collaborative statewide news network. Recovery efforts are underway in Kotzebue after a storm and severe flooding on Tuesday destroyed buildings and forced 80 residents to evacuate their homes. Emergency responders are trying to assess the damage as winter quickly closes in. Officials say the flooding destroyed Kotzebue's dock, several roads and bridges, and dozens of structures at multiple subsistence camps. The city's airport opened Wednesday night for limited flights after being closed for more than 48 hours. State officials, the Alaska chapter of the Red Cross, and members of the Alaska National Guard are expected to arrive in the coming days. Juneau city officials say they felt blindsided after Celebrity Cruises and the Gold Belt Alaska Native Corporation announced plans to develop a new cruise ship port on Douglas Island last week without consulting the city. Juneau officials, including Mayor Beth Weldon, said they are extremely unhappy, even after the cruise line issued a formal apology for the lack of communication around the project. According to Gold Belt, the companies hope to finish financial estimates and concept designs for the project by next spring and complete it during the 2027 cruise season. 5 new cargo carriers are being added to the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, which officials hope will help to expand the airport's cargo capacity. The 5 new carriers were announced during a press conference at the airport on Thursday and are expected to bring more traffic to an airport that has previously ranked as high as number 3 in the world for total tons of cargo going through. Deputy Airport Director Terry Linseth said Thursday that the new carriers are expected to bring an annual revenue increase of about $9 million to the airport, about a 7% bump. You can find the full version of these and many more stories on our website, alaskapublic.org, or download the Alaska Public Media app on your phone. Now on to our discussion for this evening. Ballot Measure 2 seeks to repeal open primaries and ranked choice voting. Alaska voters in 2020 approved a ballot measure that changed how we elect candidates. It's hailed in some quarters as a way to moderate the hyper-polarized politics embroiling the nation, yet it's unpopular among the state's conservatives. Alaska Public Media's Liz Ruskin reports on the origins of ranked choice voting here and why the right doesn't like it.
It was almost like being a venture capitalist or an inventor. We actually had like a concept, we had it put together.
Anchorage attorney Scott Kendall used to be chief of staff to Governor Walker. For 2 years, Kendall says he couldn't get legislators to move beyond the gridlock.
They all feared being primaried, primary as a verb, that if they didn't toe the party line, they would get taken out. And, we created a system that was designed for them to get reelected, but also designed for them to fail at their jobs.
So in 2018, Kendall started thinking of a way to open the primary. He opted for a primary in which the top 4 candidates advanced to the general. And then he needed a way to narrow the field without creating a spoiler effect where 2 candidates from the same party would split the vote and elect a competitor. That's where ranked choice came in. Then Kendall says he started seeking money to mount a ballot measure campaign.
I started looking for funding both inside the state, which we had a little bit of success, and then outside the state. But the ideas And the writing of the measure was all done here in Alaska by Alaskans.
The system is unpopular among conservatives. For many, the problem is exemplified in the special election for U.S. House in 2022. Ranked choice did not, in that case, eliminate the spoiler effect. Let's look at the results in that race. As you can see, Democrat Mary Peltola finished first, followed by Republicans Sarah Palin and Nick Begich III. Opponents of the system point out that more Alaskans voted for the two Republicans combined than voted for the single Democrat. For round two, Begich finished last, so he was eliminated, and his ballots are re-examined for the voters' second choice. If every Begich voter ranked Sarah Palin second, it would have looked like this. But that's not what happened. Instead, barely half of his voters chose Palin second. About a third chose Mary Peltola second. And about a fifth of Begich voters did not rank a second candidate. So Peltola won. That was the special election, and a similar thing happened in the regular election in November 2 years ago. Peltola got more first-choice ballots than the other candidates, and the second and third rankings didn't give Palin enough of a boost to overtake Peltola's lead. The lesson many Republicans took from this is that it's bad to have two Republican candidates on the general election ballot. For example, here's a voter we spoke to this summer, Ludmila Macy of Chugiak.
I'm Republican, and I definitely don't like ranking choice. I wish they get rid of the ranking choice. It's complicated for Republican Party.
Yeah, in 2020, I supported the effort to keep it the way it was. Keep our primary, keep the general election, let the parties make the decision.
One person who has changed his view is former U.S. Senator Mark Begich, a Democrat who was a leading voice against ranked choice voting. Begich worried, among other things, that the new system might mean Democratic candidates would be shut out of the general election. Now he believes it encourages candidates to be less polarized, to campaign on who they are.
I have changed my view, and I've seen it give voters much more choices.
The repeal measure will appear on the ballot as ballot measure 2. A yes vote would do away with the open primary and ranked choice voting and replace them with party primaries and single choice general elections. A no vote would keep the system that's been in use since 2022. Reporting from Anchorage, I'm Liz Ruskin.
Joining me tonight to make their case for whether to retain or repeal Alaska's new voting system is former Lieutenant Governor and former Senator Lauren Lehman, who is a spokesperson for the Yes on 2 campaign to repeal the current system, and Julie Luckey is the campaign manager for the No on 2 campaign that seeks to retain it. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for being in here in person today. So let's start with, we just saw this video about ranked choice voting. Julie, boil down your position for us. In about a minute or so, tell us what your top 3 reasons are for open primaries and ranked choice voting.
Well, my top one reason is I am a nonpartisan, and like 60% of Alaskans, I chose not to register with a party. An open primary ballot has been an Alaskan staple for most of the years we've been in statehood, and our current open primary system allows every single Alaskan to vote for any candidate on the ballot. So we don't have to choose a ballot, limit our choices. We can vote for anybody we want, and we can also vote for people from a different party. So if you like a Republican one race, an independent one race, a Democrat another race, our open primary allows you to do that. And we saw a little over half, 52% of voters actually do that across parties in their primary ballot. I think reason number 2 would be that the ranked choice voting allows us to eliminate the spoiler effect, which means basically if you've got a few candidates that are aligned, the voters can rank their candidates in order of preference. And what we see is the spoiler effect, which would be the spoiler candidate, which is the candidate that gets the fewest amount of votes, would be eliminated. And then you look at those second choices, they're allocated against for the other candidates. And I think that kind of fits our Alaskan. We often have third-party candidates. We often have independent candidates, and so that eliminating that spoiler effects allows voters to to consolidate that support around a candidate that is competitive. And I think lastly, it's just the matter of making all of our elected officials accountable to all of their constituents. And so one of the things that the system does in itself, open primaries to ranked choice voting, is moves that competitive race down to the general election. So we used to have a lot of races that were decided in that primary, and in a case where you might not be the same party as your elected official, really sometimes you were left out of being able to vote on that elected official because they get taken out in that primary. And so it allows more of the voters to vote for candidates regardless of what party they belong to.
All right, thank you for starting us off. And please, Lieutenant Governor, give us your top 3 reasons for why you think voters should reject this current voting system.
Well, a yes on 2 returns us exactly to what we were doing for the last 25 years before the change. And then even before that, we essentially had a system very much like that. And so it's not an unusual system at all. It's not one that, I hear politics as usual. Well, yeah, politics as usual. That's the way just about, all states except for one, now 2 with Alaska, do their elections. And so, I was against this in 2020, and I, didn't campaign hard, but I spoke out against it because I saw the danger that
What
it
is
could
the
provide.
danger? What is it in your mind?
There are several dangers to it. It's convoluted, it's complex, it's confusing to people. In fact, I was in the voting line just 2 days ago with my wife, and a voter there saw me, recognized me, and pulled me aside and asked questions about how to deal with ranked choice voting, in that election. And I explained to him that he didn't have to mark beyond 1. If he didn't want to, he could, but I said that choice is up to you, and it wouldn't invalidate his ballot if he didn't do it. So what I want to do, when I was in the legislature, I was in the Senate, we responded to the United States Supreme Court that said political parties have the right for association. And so what we did at the time was said, okay, parties can choose their rules, and the rules that the Republican Party chose, which is what I'm a member of, was that it would allow everybody to vote in its primary except those who are registered to a party. And if any of those voters want to vote in the Republican primary, 30 days before the election or more.
They have to register.
Yeah, just register as a nonpartisan or as an undeclared. And then they can get access to the ballot.
Let me stay with you for a moment, sir. Scott Kendall's first quote in the story, he said the legislature would gridlock because lawmakers feared if they compromised, they'd be ousted in a primary. As he put it, the old system was designed for them to get reelected, but also designed for them to fail at their jobs. Did you see that dynamic at work in the legislature, that lawmakers weren't open to bipartisan compromise due to fear of being punished in a primary?
Well, I heard what he said on that, and it just shows me that he's never been a legislator. He's never gone through what I have. I spent 14 years in the legislature. You're part of a caucus, you're dealing with people. I knew how to go out and count votes and how to get votes. I didn't always get them, but I knew the process, and there's just a lot of interpersonal interactions in the legislature to get things done. And what may have happened is, he was chief of staff to Governor Walker. He may not have got what he wanted to get done in the legislature, so he felt that was gridlock. But that really is the process that is used in the legislature, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is the legislative process.
All right, Julie, to you. You referenced gridlock in the legislature and Congress as a reason to support open primaries and ranked choice. How does that change partisan politics in your mind?
So I think, Lauren was actually a senator when I started as a baby staffer, so we spent many years in the trenches together. And I think that what I saw, and I'm just going to bring up a couple of years as an example. So what we saw kind of in the years leading up to 2020, when we approved open primaries and ranked choice voting, was we did see a lot of partisan gridlock, and we did see the phenomenon where they call it being primaried, right? So there was a lot of arguments about the size of the permanent fund and about a long-term fiscal plan. We had declining oil prices, and we had a session that started, and I'll just talk about the Alaska House, right? It's been fairly even for a while, 23 Republicans and then a mix of Democrats and independents, or maybe 21. And what we saw was a legislature that did not get organized for a record 31 days. And that was that partisan fighting of who would be the Speaker of the House. And I think it's very similar to what we saw in the U.S. Congress just recently. After not organizing for 31 days, they had 2 special sessions, 59 days, and one of them actually organized with a third of the legislature in Wasilla. And it's hard enough to get legislators to come to the table when they're in one town, but impossible to really work on that long-term fiscal plan. Eventually, we had some legislators kind of cross that aisle and decide to make a deal and negotiate. And what we saw in 2020 is that primary. This is what Mr. Kendall was talking about, where legislators that had crossed that aisle were then targeted in that closed Republican primary. We had 10 sitting legislators targeted. And I don't think that any legislators deserve to have their job because they're incumbents, but I do believe, as I was saying earlier, that all of the constituency, even if you're not a Republican, should be able to vote on whether or not that person is retained.
And so, if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is you saw signs of more compromise in the legislature because they didn't have to worry about that compromising would mean they'd lose to a more partisan challenger in the primary. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we did see that in 2020, where there were, in that closed primary, incumbents that crossed the aisle were losing the race by a very small margin, and then were not able to stand up for election with their constituency in the general.
And Mr. Lehman, do you think that legislative gridlock is a problem in Juneau and that the closed primary discourages lawmakers from compromise?
Yeah, well, I've heard now 3 times, twice from Julie and now once from you, that it was a closed primary. It was not a closed primary. It was an open primary, or you can say a semi-open. It was open to all voters, 80% of the voters of Alaska, except for those who chose to be registered to another party. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm here basically today to defend a yes on 2, rather than the decisions the Republican Party is making about its ballot. But that is the decision that it made and worked under for 25 years. And the No on 2 campaign has misrepresented what that is, misrepresented what it would be intended to do in the future, and is essentially using people like first responders and veterans and others like that, the people we love and really appreciate, using them as, to essentially scare them that they might not have the right to vote. And that's just absolutely not true. And so, is there gridlock in Congress and in the legislature? Of course. That is part of our the process that we have, and eventually we have to compromise to build consensus to get something passed. I called it the rule of 21, 11, and 1. You have to get 21 votes in the House, right, 11 in the Senate, and a governor to be able to get anything passed.
All right, Julie, Lauren just said that the No on 2 campaign is using scare tactics. I want you to respond to that, and then I want to ask you the next question.
Well, and I'll agree with Lauren, is that in this respect is that that it is, we call it a closed primary, but it is really a party rule primary. So really the party gets to decide how open or closed it is. So the Republican Party has in the past allowed nonpartisans and undeclareds to participate in that primary. But when you look at the actual language that's in the statute, it is based on the party rule. So at any point, any party can choose to close the ballot to undeclared and nonpartisan voters based on the way the ballot Measure 2 is written. And what we have heard from the backers of ballot Measure 2 is that they would like to see a closed primary where Republicans vote for Republicans and Democrats vote for Democrats. And that's where, as a nonpartisan, at the very least, with the party rule primary, I did have my choices diminished. I could either choose to take part in the Republican primary, which only had Republican candidates, or take part in that other primary. And I think the concern is that precedent, we've seen a lot of unprecedented things happen, and we've seen a lot of what we considered settled precedent change in the last few years. And so I think just looking at how things have happened in the past is not necessarily an indicator of what's happening in the future. And again, the plain language of the statute that's being put into place would allow that to happen, and we've seen the discussion of closing that primary.
So we heard during the story that we listened to, and also Lauren referenced that, and Julie, I'm sure you've heard criticism that the new voting system is confusing, that people don't understand it. What do the 2022 election results show about whether voters were confused by this new system?
Yeah, I'd like to start with a little bit of context in the fact that 2022 elections, because of the special election that we talked about earlier, were a bit confusing. So our first ranked choice voting election, as you alluded to, was to fill the remainder of Don Young's seat. And it was on the same piece of paper as our regularly scheduled primary. So you had a pick one primary on one side and our first ranked choice voting election on the other side. And there were roughly 190,000 votes. We saw 99.8% of those ballots being cast that were valid. So a very, very low error rate. I think it was roughly 350 were actually overvoted. So we also saw a lot of people ranking. So majority, 73% of people ranked in that race. And I think that Alaskans really were able to use that ballot. They were able to vote that ballot, and they were able to show that they understood how to rank. And the low error rate just proves that.
All right, thank you. Lauren, about half of Alaskan voters are not registered with a political party. Given that, how does a closed primary system serve non-Democrats and non-Republicans? Before 2022, they had to pick a primary ballot and couldn't select from a full pool of candidates. Why was that a better system?
The allowance for political parties to associate, and there's a misconception by a lot of people that somehow political parties are so powerful and that there are bosses that control it. That's not true. Certainly not true in Alaska by any stretch. Political parties are basically associations generally of people who share some political philosophy. But I can assure you that in the party I'm a member of, that philosophy or those philosophies are all over the place. There are people who may think like me on some issue and be totally opposite on another. And so political parties just basically are an association. The U.S. Supreme Court says we have the right to associate as parties, and so the rule, essentially you ask the question, but I will say, why should somebody who's registered as a Democrat vote in the Republican primary to choose who their candidate is going to run against? What do you think they're going to do? Going to lowball somebody or pick somebody that will be a weaker candidate. And so the solution that the Republican Party and the Democrats actually initially did a very similar thing, is just say, okay, it's going to be open to anybody except somebody who's registered in that party. Yeah.
Julie, you referenced a statistic from the 2022 primary saying that 51% crossed over in their primary balance. Explain what that means.
And so that means, if you look at what we had prior to, and I do want to point out that, since 1947, we basically have had an open primary ballot most of our years. So the party rule primary that's been in place has really only been in place since the year 2000. And before then, any Alaskan could vote for any candidate they wanted to. So I think it's a very Alaskan system. But when we talk about cross-party voting, what we're talking about is where you have a primary ballot that's one party, whether it's, initially we had 6 different ballots and we had 2 leading up to our 2022 election. There's a person cannot vote for, obviously, if you have to pick a ballot, you cannot vote for somebody of the party that's on that ballot. And in that case, it was just the Republicans had a separate ballot. But what we saw when we opened that primary back up is that voters could choose to vote for a Republican on one side and somebody else on another side. And when I talk about that cross-party voting, that's what I'm talking about, is a voter had the ability to say, hey, I like a Republican in this race, but in this race I might like an independent, or I might like an AIP, or I might like a Democrat. And so that's what we saw, is people taking advantage of that ability to vote for more than one party.
All right, we only have a few seconds left. How will you spend this last week in the lead up to the election?
Well, I voted.
So you've done your civic duty.
I voted 2 days ago. I called my brother, who was in a remote community in Alaska, and just wanted to make sure he had a chance to vote. And he confirmed this morning that he had, but
right.
just reminded our children. And we're just basically doing the best we can with limited funds that we have on the Yes on 2 campaign. We're going up against humongous money machine.
We'll have to leave it there, sir.
$12 million. I'd like to talk about
We're
what
out of
the
time.
big money
I'm sorry.
people, why are they playing in Alaska's politics?
We'll have to leave it there. Julie, a couple of seconds. What's the last week look like?
For last week, we're going to be doing the same thing, getting everybody, just telling everyone, get out to vote. It is so important. There are so many close races right now. So important to get out to vote, and we encourage voting no on 2.
Thank you so much to our guests this evening. That's it for this edition of Alaska Insight. Visit our website, alaskapublic.org, for breaking news and reports from our partner stations across the state. While you're there, sign up for our free daily digest so you won't miss any of Alaska's top stories of the day. Thanks for joining us this evening. Remember to vote on November 5th. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night. Thank you.